Our gospel reading this morning is from Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted.
The 20th century was a century of the never again, wasn't it? After World War I, the global community thought that we would never again experience war on that scale. And then they created the circumstances for World War II, which was far worse. After the Holocaust, the world said that never again would a genocide happen under our watch. But ethnic cleansing continues to happen around the world. And after World War II, we tried again to build a global community to prevent war, only to find the Cold War breaking out between the East and the West, with all the proxy conflicts that were fought in place of full-scale war. And when the Soviet Union finally fell, we said, oh good, never again, right? And we discovered the specter of global terrorism. We're good at saying never again, aren't we? But we have a hard time keeping our promises. Even in our personal lives, how many of us have experienced things or done things where we've said never again, only to end up in similar situations time and time again? It can give us a very cynical outlook on the future, can't it? We've been following through Luke and Jeremiah, looking over the various failings and frailties of ancient Israel and Judah, the community of the exiles, and the way that Jesus in his own day, in his own time, through his teaching, exposes the weakness of the human heart and of human resolve in a selfish and a self-absorbed world, a world that also has stopped believing in the future. And what we learn is that while we can say never again to ourselves, we know that more than likely, eventually, we will fall into the same patterns, even if we hit bottom. Who will interrupt this vicious cycle? It's a question that Paul asks in Romans. Is it possible that we might be able to with some outside help? We have 2 passages about hitting bottom and God's response to us when we do. Our passage from Joel is one that's hard to place in history. No one really knows the date of Joel, and Joel is kind of an obscure figure. He doesn't appear elsewhere in the Bible. The circumstances he describes in his book are vague. He portrays a massive plague of locusts that have invaded the country like an army. What country is he talking about? Well, we're not sure. It could be ancient Israel. It could be a little later. It could be the kingdom of Judah. But it doesn't really matter. Because of its obscurity, the message of Joel has always had a very universal kind of feel. Peter quoted it on the day of Pentecost. You may have recognized those words in the second part of the passage that Rachel read for us. What's it like, though, to cry out to God when we're at wit's end and have God respond with a message of plenty? So here's the situation. Basically, the people had survived this locust plague only to kind of take stock of the situation and find that their food was destroyed, their livestock was ruined, their homes were filled up with insects. They'd gotten into everything and eaten everything in sight. Now the people face a very uncertain future. Now it takes a long time to grow crops. I don't know if you grow a garden or anything, but you start in the spring, and then you hope that you'll get some food out of it throughout the summer and into the fall. But it takes a long time, and it takes even longer in a region of the world where rainfall is only limited to a particular season, like it is in Israel. You have to wait, and you have to try to survive until the next rainy season when you can plant again. And so, if you think about it, there's a certain horror and helplessness in understanding that you're going to starve to death, and that you're going to watch your family and your neighbors starve with you. It's not a pretty picture. But what's God's response? God's response is the promise of plenty in the midst of poverty. One of the things that we understand from the war in Syria is that one of the reasons that people were so willing to fight against their government with terrorist groups like the Islamic State was that they had suffered massive crop failures. They were starving, and revolution gave them an alternative. Maybe there was something they could do about it. Maybe there was some kind of other future that they could look forward to. So these kind of crop failures can cause the collapse of the social order. We've seen it play out time and time again in history. And even if the king called out the troops, it's grim thinking of a national army attacking its own starving people in order to keep the peace. What kind of a peace is it? Not a very good one. But God doesn't let things get that grim. Instead, God sends Joel to give a message of hope in the midst of the terrible situation. God says, never again to the people will this happen. Look with me at verses 23 through 27. Joel says, be glad, people of Zion. Rejoice in the Lord your God, for he has given you the autumn rains, because he is faithful. He sends you abundant showers, both autumn and spring rains as before. The threshing floors will be filled with grain. The vats will overflow with new wine and oil. I will repay you for the years of the locusts. The locusts have eaten, the great locust and the young locust, the other locusts and the locust swarm. My great army that I sent among you, you will have plenty to eat until you are full. And you will praise the name of the Lord your God, who has worked wonders for you. Never again will my people be shamed. Then you will know that I am in Israel, that I am the Lord your God, and that there is no other. Never again will my people be shamed. God speaks of second chances, of unexpected rains, that bad times will be just a memory, just a bump in the road and not a catastrophic end. And this must have happened because Joel has been preserved for us, and it continues to remind us that we can have hope in the midst of dark times. When things look bad, we can turn to God, and God will provide somehow, some way. Joel tells us that in the darkest moments, these are actually opportunities for God to act. And if we could just remember that, we can remember to turn to God in those moments. If we can be open to seeing God act in a new way, a different way, maybe something that in a way we hadn't thought of before. We will see God act in surprising circumstances with people that we didn't expect to hear from. Look what the second part of this passage says. And afterward, says Joel, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days. I will show wonders in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, before the coming of the great dreadful day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be deliverance, as the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls. It's an important reminder that God's provision is both spiritual and physical. Sometimes we look for the spiritual and forget the physical provision. And sometimes we look for the physical provision and we forget the spiritual. It's always both. Because as God provides, God also calls us back to faithfulness. Joel's message is for people who are tired and broken. And Joel says to them, don't give up. Nothing is too hard for God to deliver you out of. Look to God and find your provision and your restoration there. And in many ways, we get the same message in Luke from Jesus. We have a parable about a spiritual contest. Now, they don't know they're in a contest here, but this is the way Jesus sets it up in the story. The contestants are two men. One is a very religious man, a Pharisee, and then the other is a man who is barely considered to be Jewish by his own people, a tax collector. A man who took money on behalf of the oppressors in Rome and Jerusalem. Now, tax collectors often cheated people by extorting them extra, by collecting too much and enriching themselves. As long as the Romans or King Herod get their tax money, they were content to look the other way. Especially since those who were most often being extorted were people without any influence or power. And so, in setting up this story this way, we understand that by reputation, the tax collector is not a good person. But the Pharisee, at least by reputation, is a good person. He is the most esteemed person in his community. He's religious. He's a leader. He's a teacher. He leads by example. He's got everything together. But what's in his heart? He betrays himself, doesn't he? What does he say? This is the way Jesus tells it. To some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, and I give a tenth of all I get. Nice guy. Nice guy. He's only good by reputation, but not by anything that goes on in his heart or in his mind. And sometimes I'm glad that, I think all of us are glad sometimes that we can't see what really goes on in our hearts and minds every so often. But the tax collector is different. The tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus says, I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, Jesus is not arguing that this tax collector is inherently better than the Pharisee. What Jesus wants us to see is that their spiritual condition is the same. Only the tax collector, though, has the humility to understand his spiritual poverty. Only the tax collector asks God for mercy. All of us, as good as we can be, as religious as we can be, will only ever be spiritual novices in the presence of God. And we need to understand our need, not only ours, but also the needs of those with us and all the needs of those who come to us, searching for God, searching for hope, searching for truth. God doesn't give us what we ask for. Or God won't give us what we ask for, especially if we don't think we need it. Only the tax collector understood his need and asked for it. So if we don't see our common ground with our neighbors, we won't be able to help them. We might confidently say to God, never again in repentance, but only God can truly guarantee what will be. In our spiritual poverty, we need to understand that only God can truly satisfy our need for wholeness and healing. God is the one who promises plenty in the midst of poverty. And so I hope that as we think about our role as Christians in this world, we understand the best way we can be spiritual leaders is to be humble, to see others as ourselves, to recognize our needs are the same as everyone else's needs. It's a different take on sharing faith, but when we have the courage to share our faith with others in such a way that it helps them to understand that they've got nothing to be afraid of by coming to church, nothing to be afraid of by bringing up spiritual matters with us, that's when we really get opportunities to invite people, to encourage them to pray, to encourage them to read the Bible, to encourage them in life. All of us want to be able to do that, but we're afraid. We're afraid that the people that we interact with have different spiritual needs than we do. We're afraid that they're not like us, that sometimes we're the weird ones for going to church. That the people who don't want to know what we know, don't want to be invited to connect with the church family. But the truth is that they do. And you and I have the opportunity to help them find their connection to God right here in our church. And I think we can do that if we stay humble, if we stay true to our own sense of faith, if we understand that the person next to you is more like you than you know. In spite of all of our divisive politics and our cultural differences, our economic differences, it's still true that what unites us is far greater than what divides us. Jesus is speaking to you and I in this parable. He's asking us, don't be like the Pharisee, but look for the tax collectors of this world because you're a lot like them. The people who have experienced the ups and downs of life and are looking for hope and are looking for a future. Over this last couple of weeks, I had some exchange students here from Germany. And for whatever reason, I always take, whenever people visit from out of the country, my favorite place to take them after seeing the falls is just going down Buffalo Avenue from downtown to the Grand Island Bridge. I think that's the best part of our city. You know, I grew up here. I love going down Buffalo Avenue because it's got if you know the history of the city, it really tells the whole story. It starts with the Tesla power station, and you see all the developing industry all the way down along the river. Basically tells the rise and fall of our nation, or of our region. But it also tells us, if we take a look, how ground down so many people are in our community. And seeing all this environmental degradation, all the green mounds, they asked me if any of the kids from our area participated in the climate change protests with Greta Thunberg. Because the students, where these students had come from in Germany, they had them. And I said, hey, look around you. I don't get that many people here in our community actually believe in the future. Because I think if we believe in the future, we'd make different choices, And I think that's the sad truth of the matter. Do you believe in the future? What do people believe about the future in our community? Not only for you, but for our town, for our world, and also, what do you believe about the future for our church? I mean, sometimes I get a little bit down, and I worry more than I believe. But then I reflect on these passages from Luke and from Joel that tell us that when we get down, when we get discouraged, God has a plan, a future for us, that we can come to Him even in the midst of being beat down and discouraged. And God will accept us and love us as we are. We have the opportunity through our faith in Jesus, the one who promises plenty in the midst of poverty, to show people a hope and a future by what we do here in our church. With God, we can believe in the future, and we can help our community believe again too.